So welcome everyone to our monthly brown bag discussion series. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, Marc-Andre Pigeon. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. And before we begin today's conversation, I want to acknowledge the fact that we're coming to you from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis. From them, we can learn to be grateful for this land, the water, and the skies that make all of this possible. And we can also learn from them the importance of recognizing our shared responsibility over these resources. How we have to work together to make sure they're still there for our children and grandchildren. In some indirect way, that's a bit about what our talk's about, is about these collaborative responsibilities. And we're going to have a conversation with Paul Cabaj about second tier collaboration in cooperatives. Before we begin that conversation, just a word about our brown bag series. It's structured around conversations, presentations with invited guests, and it's really, that's a part of the brown bag, but the bigger part is about creating space for informal conversations, because these are the tissues that are going to pull us together and help us deal with the challenges that we all face as a society, as individuals. So to that end, we've structured the process for some good informal conversation, not just kind of the formal bits. So what we're going to do is today, it's a bit different than normal. We're going to just have a conversation, Paul and I. We'll do that for about 20 minutes, maybe a little less. Then we'll do our breakout, which is a kind of standard part of our event. And then we'll regroup as a collective, and we'll have a conversation collectively. So that's the way we're going to roll this thing. And now let me introduce our speaker. So Paul Cabaj is the executive director of the Alberta Community and Cooperative Association, or ACCA, and he took on that role in April 2019. He's also, starting in February 2021, the executive director of the British Columbia Cooperative Association, or BCCA. Paul has an extensive background in leading social and economic innovation, and has a long history of cooperative development, both in Canada and abroad. In fact, I'll just, as an aside, every now and then I'll pull up a document, I'll read something that's been written by people who are interested in the cooperative sector, and more often than not, I'll find a thank you to Paul for his contribution to the research. Before his appointment as the executive director of the ACCA and BCCA, Paul was with Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada as their manager of cooperative development and strategic partnerships. Paul has also worked as a consultant, researcher, entrepreneur, leader, and restaurateur, I might add, and fantastic cook. He sits on several cooperative boards and committees, both locally, provincially, and nationally. And these connections provide Paul with the inspiration and motivation to push the cooperative movement forward. So welcome, Paul. It's a real pleasure to have you here today and be part of this conversation. I'm going to jump in with an easy kind of warm-up question, and then we'll dig in a little more to the topic at hand, which is, what is the future of cooperative association? So let's start easy. Tell me a bit about your journey into the cooperative sector. What kind of brought you in to the sector, and what are the problems and challenges you see in the cooperative sector very generally? So let's start there.
Well, thanks, Marc-Andre, and happy to be here, and happy to see so many familiar faces too. Or names at least in the crowd here. I really get a sense of there's the connection and the movement around this, and that's one of the pleasures I've had in the last little while, seeing how much leadership is starting to pop up in the sector. That gives me great hope in terms of where we're going next. And part of it is what we're at. I grew up in it. I fish and water. I grew up in small town Alberta. Co-ops were everywhere. My first job where I got a paycheck was the co-op. Right here, this is my great grandfather's.
Out, Paul, we can't make it out. Yeah. We can't make it out.
UFA share certificate, actually. number 16 at the UFA St. Paul. And that's where we grew up. And I didn't know about co-ops until really what was there. And then I started doing work overseas. And I encountered what co-ops can do in developing countries, where it made a significant difference in people's lives. And that got me going more into it in terms of a way of doing economic development and working things through. Well, I was doing a business degree at one point at the U of A, and taking Chinese at one point. My whole point around that was make $1 billion selling a $1 trinket to the great nation of China. And then I could do social good with that. I could invest in something like a trusteeship or something. And then I took a business ethics course at that time. And I came away from that course with business and ethics thinking, well, the ethics course was mostly about what we could get away with. And I contrast that to then shifting over to the co-op model is the ethics come first. I think it's much more front center. We're not perfect about that. And that certainly appeals to me. We can do business that treats people, as members, as building something together, as opposed to market forces that we need to manipulate. And again, I'm not against the free market, but there's something there, and that I think we need it. I think our thirst is there around a model that treats people as people. And again, we're not perfect at it. So that's a big part of it for me. And you know, part of me back then too, at one point when I was looking at a career shift from doing kind of a foreign service overseas and stuff, I also considered the priesthood, quite honestly. And it wasn't the religion so much, it was the community. And actually an intentional community with a set of values. And say what you say about religion, those are connected to a community with a set of values, have better health outcomes, they have better connections. There's a range of things like that. So that's another thing around co-ops is intentionally building community, not in the kind of commune hippie sense, but working together, overcoming our differences on a common set of values. So there's a bit of a component there that really kind of drives me. And I think that's the kind of the co-op movement philosophy a bit behind what I'm doing now, why I'm so involved in this.
Thanks, Paul. I did not know about the priesthood path not taken. We will have to have a conversation about that another time. But let me kind of pick up on some of the things you were saying. You're giving a lot of examples that I think that I would characterize as kind of micro, you know, like small interventions. I remember you telling me about your partner, your wife. She had a housing co-op that really changed her life, and those are really shaping experiences. But one of the challenges in the cooperative sector is how to scale, right? How to kind of move beyond and have the local level and kind of have a broader influence. And so that's where these trade associations or cooperative associations like ACCA and BCCA come into play. And if we can add to the list Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, in the credit union world, the Canadian Credit Union Association, the World Council of Credit Unions, International Cooperative Association, then there's federations. There's all the cooperative sector is a bit unique in having these kind of second layer or third layer entities that ostensibly are about getting scale and doing things collectively on a bigger level. At the same time, you know, for as long as I've been around the sector, there's been also this kind of existential fear that these cooperative associations are kind of somehow living on borrowed time. You know, and I'm just kind of wondering what you're thinking about that. And part of the reason I've heard that explains that concern is that the sector itself, particularly in Canada, maybe not in developing countries, but in Canada in particular, you're seeing this kind of increasing pull, you know, very big cooperatives, big credit unions, and smaller cooperatives and smaller credit unions, and then that creates these challenges for the association. So are these associations still relevant in a Canadian context? Elsewhere, how do you see that kind of shaking out? What do you think of those fears?
Well, I think they're still relevant. And I think what you've talked about are long-term trends in the co-op movement, both based on social changes, but also just traditional changes with the co-ops. The challenge of large and small co-ops has been there almost from the beginning, you know, even back before Rochdale and others. There's these cyclical pieces when the sector kind of matures, there's consolidation that happens, they take out markets, and then there's smaller ones, those either disappear, go through, any kind of associative element on there gets warped out. And with any kind of association or federation, for example, which is another second tier thing, when you have, and this is a case in many places I've seen, both here in Canada and overseas, once you have one or two larger members where the membership, it seems to be like almost of 20 or 30% of one member is of the market, that's where there's significant challenges to any kind of association. So if any one sector is too strong, 20 or 30% of the role, there's almost that kind of number where you have to start to watch where things get questions. I think that's happened in the credit union sector, and I think it's happened across the board in other sectors as well, including here in Alberta, a number of areas. So that's one thing to know, that it's historical too. There's other trends beyond that. And with that cycle, there's the associations come and go. And I think it's incumbent on us in the co-op sector to be aware of that, but also Where does the sector then revive itself in terms of its work through the association model? What are the roles in the association, which I think for myself stands as, because it, for in our case, as opposed to specific federations like the credit unions or the retail co-ops, we have because we have so much broad membership, it's the ecosystem perspective on things. Where are the challenges across the board? Where we're seeing the weaknesses and the strengths? And we're almost have a bit of anecdotal, and I think what we're getting towards is more actual factual data to kind of bring together to see what's going on now, where can we address issues now, but also how we can project in the future. And I think that's where I'm most excited about the roles of association, is what role we can play as getting the leaders in the sector to think beyond themselves, their own specific co-op service, to the broader movement in a way that strengthens us all and allows us to be more relevant in the future. And that for me ties into some of the work that you and I are doing and others around the co-op intelligence unit. You know?
So let me dig in a bit on that, Paul. Where do you see those kind of universal ecosystem issues coming up? And maybe while you're at it, you can speak a little bit about the CIU and just explain to folks what it is and what it's doing.
Okay. Well, there are two things on that. Universally, one of the factors is just where our economy's at. And you know, look at banking credit unions, for example. The competition is not other credit unions. Competition is the Royal Bank or Citibank, right? And in order to actually survive on that and provide service and achieve economies of scale and watch your margins, you have to grow. You know, for me, economies of scale is pretty much close to the law of gravity. You have to pay attention to it. If you don't, it's to your detriment. And the issue is where that scale is at. Is that scale at the local level in your small community, at the provincial or the national level? And so once you enter into those levels, the whole dynamic changes. And that's where the problems and the challenges tend to happen in terms of scope. I think the biggest challenge for the co-op sector as a whole is the fact we don't have enough international co-ops. Because again, Desjardins is a fantastic bank. Sorry, bank, I shouldn't use that. Financial cooperative, bad. And you know, there's lots of discussion with what's taking place with that, but really the competition for the bank for equitable financial services is much broader than that. It's international, it's open banking, it's a large investment banks. Like that's where we have to start thinking at scale. And I think the next big challenge for us is around that, because the international competition is what's driving the consolidation, right? Because of bringing costs together. What's the way around that? Both we have to focus on what's happening on the smaller level to help new co-ops form, because once consolidation happens, gaps get made for sure. So what are the gaps being made? On the other hand, we have to get much better at organizing ourselves international, both on the finance end, on the retail end. So it's thoughts like that and setting table for those kinds of discussions at the association level. I think what we have to provoke the conversations, the thinking, the forecast and the strategy, in some cases, the action.
And the CIU, Paul, can you just tell folks a bit about that, what that stands for? And what
Co-op intelligence unit, again, just a way we're trying to get a center of gravity where we can start to do some of this forward thinking. We've, you know, had some people on there, and Marc-Andre, you're not the smartest guy I know, but I have asked you to join this. Sorry, I did the personal thing right there. But good thinkers on this, people who've been committed to the sector and involved in both research and strategy. Where's the co-op sector going? How can the co-op sector respond to the gaps of the future? Because all co-ops started addressing gaps. They came together to achieve economies of scale in either purchasing power or sales to fill a gap, right? And historically, that's where they've come from. And from my sense of things, that's where they'll come from in the future. So where are those gaps? Where are the pain points? Where do we have to look at? And so I think for the CIU, it's looking at those pain points and how we can start to plan and address those, and also reflect back, how do we, as the current co-ops in Canada and in the US, and for me, I think quite internationally, shift our current practices to address those gaps too. So.
Thanks, Paul. So you know, just for folks to know a bit of background, Paul and I promised each other we would not engage in our usual banter, and I see Paul's already broken the rule, but I will stay above the fray, Paul, and ask you you've talked a lot about scale, and what about scale at the association level? And I can't help but think that you've kind of done something interesting with ACCA and BCCA, where is that part of an effort to achieve scale at an association level? Is that what's going on, or is there something else with that kind of, and maybe just explain to folks what exactly is going on
Yeah.
in terms of your leadership?
Well, I always hate to say it's one factor. Scale is certainly one. And in any case, anytime someone gives you one answer or the rule of threes, they're lying, because there's one of many. There's never only one answer. Scale is one part of it. The reason that happened is, well, in part because I knew many of the actors involved. I worked in the co-op sector in BC, lived there for quite some time, started co-ops down there, also worked nationally, and had, when I was able to work in Ottawa, which had a sense of what was going on across the country with associations, I got a feel of what was going on and what the tensions were and what this animal was as provincial co-op associations. So that was certainly part of it. And also had some good connections with the folks in BC when I took the position in Alberta. And if you look side by side at the strategic plans done by the board in BC and the board in Alberta, done completely separately with completely different facilitators, the differences were grammatical. Even the words themselves, 90% of the words were almost exactly the same. And if that's where things were going, then why are we not working together more closely? Like it made perfect sense. So from those discussions between the interim ED and myself, Andrea Harris, who's actually on loan from Van City to make it happen. And I always like to shout out to Van City for being one of the most visionary cooperative institutions in the country. We got along well, and then we started first with some collaboration with communications. We both need comms skills. So we co-hired a comms person, and then it built from there for another hire. And now eventually led to myself getting offered the executive director position, which we're doing under a management service agreement with BCCA. And right now we've got a large number of staff. We're approaching 20 staff and contractors kind of working with us. And most of them work across provinces. Just it's happening naturally because, again, the issues and the needs are very much the same. There's certainly cultural differences, political differences, but it's going well. And the boards are starting to do some combined strategic planning. We're not sure where it's going to go, but I think it's proving the case that actually if you work on scale together and you focus on the similarities and taking advantage of those and not downplaying the differences, but being aware of them, you can accomplish great things. I think it's a good example of just the basics of collaboration.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating example. I mean, we in the credit union sector, we've seen some of this kind of similar type things happen with Ontario and BC. You know, they merged their centrals. Atlantic Canada, they have one central for the 4 provinces. There's been talk of a merger of centrals in the prairies for decades. It hasn't happened, but there does seem to be a little bit of energy on your end around this. What is it? It's not a merger though, right, Paul? It's more of a partnership. Is that? And you have this
partnership, collaboration, you know, and it's one aspect. And we had the opportunity with my staff for the last while and the board to start talking about next stages. And so the ACCA, BCCA collaboration will deepen. That's going to happen regardless of what happens with legal form. But just based on that, everything else we're doing, and it's not only, again, we're getting more involved in the active forming of co-ops, primarily through federations. We're structuring all those as federal cooperatives. So it's not about ACCA or BCCA. Right now, we're using it as a test ground in terms, so for our example, our Access, which is our shared service federation, which is based a lot on the consortium model in Quebec. It's incorporated now as a federal co-op. The idea around that is we're kind of incubating it here, but there's makes no sense why it can't be replicated across the country, where there's kind of chapters in each province. Same thing with the investment co-op federation that we're forming is going to be federal. We'll kind of incubate it here, but hopefully within a short time, it's not only a national thing, but with both of these things, with Access and with the investment co-op, we're getting inquiries and partnerships from the US as well, or South America. These things have to be international. And again, we'll incubate it here, but we have to get to scale that can work competitively across the world. You know, so I think we have some of the secret sauce of co-ops is scale, and we have to keep that central. And that if we don't have that, co-ops will not work. Right.
I want to dig in just because I don't know if people will know what you're referring to when you talk about the Access and the investment kind of projects. Can you just give us a few words on each of those? What are they about? And fascinating that they're going to be structured federally or already structured federally. They clearly have big ambitions. So just give us a little bit of a flavor of what each of those will be doing.
Well, I'd almost rather put that to I know some of my leaders, my co-leaders in the team is on the call, but I'll take a quick shot. Access is basically a shared service provision where we're calling it kind of where you can actually get partial staff to fill the needs on a range of things, not just for co-ops, but also nonprofits. Again, based on the model of the consortium, which came out of the Co-op Federation in Quebec, developed some shared services, working for some federations, and now has a very large staff with a kind of 14 different services. So working with them on that, it's a great model. It's about scale. There's huge HR issues, there's IT issues, there's legal issues. By coming together in terms of a shared service offer, we can get better supply at better prices and much better quality, right? So it's a basic concept there. And so we are members of that. Volunteer Alberta in Alberta is a member of that. BCCA will become a member. We've got legal teams coming on around that. And again, it's structured federally that can then be moved across the country. That's certainly, we can have a conversation there. We've got Corinne, who's on the side here. You guys can talk to her directly about that, where that might go. I don't like putting more work on her hands. The Investment Co-op Federation is really about supporting local investment in communities. I may not like you, Marc-Andre, but you have a good business idea. I want to put $5,000 into it. For me to be able to do that legally, quite difficult if I want to get 50 of my friends to do it in terms of the cost financially and administratively. And the Investment Co-op Federation is there to kind of not grease the wheels, to make that easier with much less cost on the ground to make local investment happen. Rather than putting your RSPs and TFSAs into condos in Vancouver, which deserves it, why can't you invest a portion of that into local businesses, local economic activity? And that needs to be scaled too, because it's there's smaller transactions, much easier to do that if we compile those together in terms of services to make it happen.
Yeah, those are, I think, really, really interesting and exciting projects. I want to shift the focus a little bit, and this will be our last question, Paul, and then we'll go into a breakout. You and I have talked about this a lot, folks with the CIU as well, but there is this kind of ever-present kind of dynamic with policymaking, and you know, that's a big part of whatever cooperatives do. It shapes it shapes what they can do and what they can't do. So can you talk to me about where do you think the cooperative sector and associations in particular need to put their focus in terms of the government relations part of things? What do we need from government? Is it just get out of the way, funding support? We've got Thomas here, who is kind of advocating for some partnerships with the kind of government-owned crowns, banks. Where do you see the opportunities and the risks in terms of the relationship with government? And bearing in mind, the autonomy and independence principle that is one of the core ideas of cooperatives.
Well, for sure. And I think for me, government relations that's one of the things I'm most excited about in recent years. We now have 2 full-time GR staff in Alberta and BC. And that's been something I've been working on for a while. Again, based on what I've seen overseas, where co-ops in other jurisdictions that have much higher presence have a pretty strong GR connection, a pretty strong relation with government. Like the highest number of GNP from co-ops to economy is New Zealand. Second is Holland. Third is Finland. Fourth is Italy. Fifth is France. So in New Zealand is 20% of the economy goes through co-ops. Holland is 18. They have very strong connections. And again, it's not necessary, and they're not arms of government. That's a big difference around that. As soon as you become an arm of government, if you're doing something on behalf of government, that's where co-ops fail. That's shown historically. That's where you start to get to the Sovietization of co-ops. You don't want that. But that GR component of coming together and showing that force and the economies of scale of political influence, right? You see beautiful examples of that, like UFA. Again, I'm not sure if my great-grandfather was actually involved in the politics, but UFA co-ops are both, they're an economic decision and in part a political one. And we sometimes undermine the political one. And for me, we have to, and UFA had that experience where they were not getting enough response from government. So they actually ran protest candidates in rural Canada, not in rural Alberta, not the urban areas, and they won. They didn't expect to. That changed things. And UFA has actually sworn off then since getting involved in politics as a party, which I agree with. Because you see where those areas where co-ops get involved in government as a party, their influence wanes significantly. But I think co-ops have to be studiously neutral, neither left nor right. And I say that co-ops are not left or right in politics, they're up. There's so much polarization going on right now that, in fact, I think we have an even greater role, a political role, to set a common table around collaboration. Polarized politics put people apart and they put into an objective, they put you up at the ramparts, and we all fall into that in terms of our bubbles. Co-ops, by taking that effort and that strength, and it's a pain in the ass to do this. bringing people together to talk who have different views and try to get a common thing. That's actually, we need even more of that now. And so it's a political decision. And it's also a way of coming together. And if we do this well, we can influence how policies are done. You know, Bill Owenkin and the co-op network in the US was the best example of that I've seen, that we're trying to adopt in some extent, and also pull from some of the other jurisdictions like Quebec, where GR is a big part of what we should do on behalf of our members. And sometimes that's getting government out of the way, depending where it is. For example, we're asking for a complete self-regulated environment for co-op securities in Alberta and hopefully BC. Get out that we do this. Co-ops don't commit fraud when it comes to securities offers. Let us do our work, right? Other cases, it's broadband, specific broadband support for the last mile. Co-ops are very good at the last mile because the market's not interested. We have to have a political force to say to government, you're going to put money out there, consider the last mile. And co-ops do that way better than anybody else. That's proven without doubt in Alberta with the largest co-op utility network in the world. We need to show that political force to make it happen rather than put stuff out there where the incumbent investor-owned organizations owned by international funds are taking that through. So we have to have that force together. We have to have the fortitude to do it. And I think we're getting there. I think we're building on that. And again, it's not only to go on behalf of the needs of our members in terms of achieving their GR needs. I think it's a need now as we've become more and more polarized. We need tables of common discussion where we work together to build community. And I think it's a partial antidote to what I'm afraid of in terms of how polarized things are that we're all experiencing, even my family.
Thanks, Paul. That's a great way to end our conversation. We're going to now bring in the rest of the audience. Just before we do that, I just want to say that the point you just made is so important. In fact, it's important enough that we at the University of Saskatchewan now have communities and sustainability as a signature area for this school or this university. And one of the core ideas is what you've just kind of elaborated, Paul. So I'm really happy to hear that. Now, again, this is where we hear from you. Because these brown bags are meant to be an opportunity for people to socialize a bit. So we're going to break you out into groups of 4-ish, and we're going to ask everyone to introduce themselves, especially if you don't know each other. If you do, great. So if you don't know each other, just tell people who you are, where you're from, what do you do, what do you work for, who do you work for? And then we're going to ask you to engage with a question or some of the conversation you've just heard, and a suggested question. So the question Paul and I came up with, but I'm going to actually suggest a second one or alternative one based on what Paul just said. But so here's one question, we'll put it in the chat, and then I'll ask Stan to put a second one in as well. What do you see as the future of cooperative associations? And maybe as an alternative, and I hope you're okay with this, Paul, but do you think cooperatives can play this role that Paul has set out? Can they help heal some of these big social divides that we're seeing emerge today? So I think those are two questions you can wrestle with if you don't have enough to go on from the introductions and just getting to know each other. So with that, I'm going to ask Stan to put everyone into a breakout group. We'll put the questions in the chat so you can see them, and we'll regroup in about 15 minutes. Okay, so now is our chance to have a kind of more communal conversation, and I'll just open it up. If there's a discussion group that want to share a point or something from their conversation or ask Paul a question, this is your chance. We'll just open it up to the audience for general queries. Anyone want to give it a go? And you can use your hand raise function under reactions, or you can put a note in chat. Stan's going to be monitoring that, and we can go from there.
Marc-Andre, Murray has his hand up.
Go ahead, Murray.
Thanks. Paul, I was, by the way, Paul, thank you. It's great to see you again. You were talking about government relations, and I completely agree. I think this is one of the critical roles that co-ops have to play, and I think you can make the argument that this has not been something that they've spent enough time on. At the individual co-op level, my reading of kind of history is that the co-ops that have tried to do both government relations and play the economic role have not fared very well. And I think I'm particularly thinking about and maybe unduly influenced by the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, who was for a while looked like they were able to hold both of these things in the air at the same time, but ultimately I think it failed. And I actually think that part of the reason they failed economically was because they spent too much time on the government relations front. Is that same critique applicable to the association level? And you're muted.
That's because I'm tired of hearing my voice. I think it's both a critique and a solution. UFA was the same thing. They actually became very involved politically, and over time, actually, the business suffered, right? And they divorced from that. Moved. I think it was at one point I questioned, why didn't you keep going? I understand completely why. The issue around that is sector specific and co-op specific. And when the sector specific co-op also primarily focuses on government relations, it becomes a one issue thing and gets too involved in government and becomes almost an arm. It can have the danger of becoming almost an arm or a vehicle of government. Whereas an association ours, which is multi-sectoral and can see across the board, it's harder for the GR to pollute the business function. So I think that's the role. And no better example of that, I think, than the co-op network in Wisconsin, Minnesota, when Bill was running it, where the larger co-ops, after a while, said, well, the GR function is doing much better around the association, because with the association come in for a small co-op and say, we have this issue for this small co-op, a small abattoir. And then we've got a large co-ops coming with us who have nothing to do with that, saying, we are a co-op, we support this issue. Very powerful. Large co-op comes in with one issue, it's one issue. And the government sees it as one issue, as opposed to a voting block. And that's where the difference is.
So quick follow-up. Does the government relations activity interfere, do you think, with the other initiatives like the access and those activities where you're trying to do something on much more operational? Does that same sort of tension apply?
Quite possibly, but that's also one reason why we're actually building new co-ops. The access is a federation. We'll be a member. We won't have control over it. We'll incubate it, but it's going to be a separate piece. And if that starts to interfere, it goes differently. GR could be tied to that, but insofar as the GR that we have with the association actually supports access, great, but it almost becomes a client or a member service for GR for like any other. But again, it's not just the individual issue. The power here is representing as a group the broad co-op issues and knowing that co-ops as a sector will vote. So that's one issue around that. So there's two functions on the GR. One is the common table and the polarization, which is part of it. The other one is representing the whole sector, saying we as a sector are interested in co-ops. They should be supported. You should listen to them. And it's not just one. And if you pay attention to one vote or one particular issue, you will get the praise and potentially the vote of a much wider group. It's that power, that economies of scale on a grassroots level. And we're starting to smell that with some recent work here. In Alberta, we're having our MLA reception in a few weeks, and I'm amazed at the number of MLAs that have signed up to come now. And, we, again, neither right nor left, but supporting co-ops on principle.
Thanks, Paul. We have a question from Sean in the chat, and I'll just read it aloud. What does it look like to balance the interests of larger co-ops who contribute significant amounts to the associations with smaller, newer co-ops who may bring in new talent and ideas? How can an association serve the interests of both groups effectively?
A good question, Sean. I'm actually a little bit upset about that because it's a hard one. It's one of the hardest things to deal with, actually, because it is a balance. The largest co-ops don't really need us if they don't want us. Like, there's not much we can do for them, except for the key issues of promoting the co-op sector, except for finding ways of forming new co-ops that can help. The question that came up in our small group was around branding and the co-op image. Marc-Andre's unit does the questions of what's the top co-op issues that co-op leaders face across the country. The last 7 years, it's been public awareness, right? I think we as an association have a role to play on that. That's another story. That's why they contribute. But that being said, the balance is quite interesting. We've got in Alberta, we've got mostly federations. It's quite concentrated on federations. We've got 37 members in Alberta, most of them federations who themselves have members. The 800 co-ops are part of that. In BC, it's very different. There's 800 members that are close. I would say 60% are independent co-ops, no federation. Lots more activity, innovation, new trying kind of incubation happening in BC, which is extremely exciting. And some of that's coming over here. And I think there's a way too for bridging that for larger co-ops is, particularly when you become larger, it becomes hard to innovate. If you help us with co-op development, you will learn things. There will be innovations that you could then adopt as well too. So if they larger federations take this as an ecosystem approach, what we're taking, I think some of them do. And I'm very pleased with the support we've been getting from some of the larger co-ops on everything from access to our investment co-op federation. We have large co-ops and credit unions as partners. It's a way of using the smaller development as an incubation, as a test ground to make things happen. So there's lots of different questions of what you posed, Sean, but that seems to be where the balance is moving. And I think the narrative we're trying to hold with our larger co-ops in particular.
Thanks, Paul. We have 3 hands raised, and just mindful of time, maybe I'll ask each of the persons who have their hand raised to ask their question, then I'll ask Paul to tie it all together. Tracey, and then Meg, and then William. So go ahead, Tracey.
Thanks, Marc-Andre. Paul, I was just wondering your thoughts on balancing scale with education, because often when we see co-op scale, they lose all of those co-op nuances, values, principles, and scale means, people serving capital.
Great question, Tracey. I saw Meg nodding her head, but I don't know if that was your question, Meg, but go ahead.
I was actually going to do a shameless plug for the group, which is related to like that scaling and moving away from values. So it is related. CoopZone is hosting a session on allyship and equity in the co-op sector and dealing with the challenges of Canadian cooperativism in particular being extra white and a little bit old, and so yeah, our session is about addressing some of those challenges and how do we overcome privilege and be effective allies. So sorry, it's a shameless plug.
Thanks, Meg. That's good. And I see you have something in chat, so folks should click that before it goes away.
Yeah.
William, your last question, and then we'll get Paul to wrap us up.
Sure. My comment actually builds a little bit on what Tracey said, and I was in a group with her and Karen maybe, and talked us into the end, so we didn't get a chance to say goodbye. But we had a great discussion. A couple of things that came up though was the role of venture capital and outside capital in this process. And what I would want to add to this discussion is what happens when again, building off scale or mergers, consolidations, how do you maintain an affiliation through associations? And an illustration would be here in Minnesota, we had a feed and grain association, all cooperatives, and then eventually they had to, for various reasons, open up to non-cooperatives. And year by year, the cooperative aspect faded away. And how do we anticipate that can happen when you do build scale and merge and all of that and prepare for it?
Great, thanks, William. A great last question. So Paul, do you want to maybe just address what Tracey and William were raising? And if Meg said anything that jumped out at you, please engage with that as well.
Yeah, I'll end with maybe some thoughts and some provocative statements maybe on that. The issue of scale is a huge concern. Well, I'll be honest though, I used to be much more involved in politics, and would go to kind of town halls and political meetings. And then there's 2 I've gone to in particular. I went to AgroPure, which is the largest dairy co-op in Quebec, and their annual general meeting. I went to FCL's in Saskatoon. And there is the same kind of intensity, focus, democracy in action that you would see at other political parties. When you get to scale, yes, certainly it's harder to kind of embody some of the values, but I still see that very evident in these large co-ops. And I think we have to appreciate that. We can't also be idealistic about it. There's a range that happens in a process. And if losing values is the only thing that's stopping you from looking at scale, I think we have to change the balance around that, because the world needs more and more co-ops. And for the world to get more co-ops and not just be experiments on the side, we need size and scale. And that challenge will always be there. The education component will always be there, but there's some very large co-ops that still do some very good education, right? And I think we can learn from each other, which is why when we look at what's happening, it can't just be in Canada. It's got to be in the US. It's got to be in Mondragon, which has an incredible example of that. It's got to be with platform co-ops. The newest form of co-ops coming on that have brought up new ideas on how to do democracy and decision making, which blows me away. Look at Stocksy, for example. They've got this kind of combined algorithm. It's crazy to watch, but it works. We've got new staff with us working now on things like quadratic voting. How can you re-engage a more active decision making? So there's values and pieces there that we can actually integrate, and that's also where, if we can do it on a smaller scale, it can also help with on the larger scale as well too. So that tension is always there, and we always have to talk about it, but there's also practicality to it. The venture capital one I find quite interesting. And for me, part of what we're doing with the Investment Co-op Federation is try to address that. So it's venture capital with a social and a local purpose, right? That I think there's some room to that, and we can do that on a small scale. But again, we have to scale it up. It's not going to happen enough on the small scale unless we have a large group. And with that, we have to be aware of education and equity around that. The one thing I'm going to say that's provocative is sometimes if a co-op has got to its point, they're there to fill a market gap. The market gap has been filled over a generation or two. Okay, they've accomplished their mission. We as leaders of organizations and co-op should not be afraid we've accomplished our mission. And if the sole purpose of going on is just to support the organization and the mission is lost, well, then close down the association or the project. That's a provocative one. One of the bravest things you can do as a leader, say, maybe it's not the right time. Maybe it's time to close it down and move on, move our energy and time to those areas where we can make a difference, where the co-op model can make a difference. That's the provocative statement. I like ending with those. I'm not sure if there's anything else, Marc-Andre.
No, that's great. Food for thought for folks. Just as we wrap up, a few things. I'm going to do a couple plugs. There's links in the chat that people should check out. I think Meg especially drew our attention to, but Tracey as well, the International Cooperative Management Program at St. Mary's. People mentioned the top co-op survey. Stan Yu, who's managing today's event, is finishing up this year's survey, and we'll be releasing our report very shortly on that. I want to mention, you mentioned quadratic voting. Murray has a great blog post on quadratic voting on our blog at the center. In fact, we tried to plug that for a while, so maybe we have to talk about that, Paul. With that, I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation. I hope you found it as engaging and as useful as I did. And maybe just a reminder, we have these brown bag talks every month. We're going to be announcing our next speaker soon. Stay tuned for that and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.